Yeah, why not? Record on this computer. I'll grab me my notes here. So are you having any difficulty running around through good old Canvas? How's Canvas treating you?
I had problems at first, but I've pretty much figured it out, except like Dr. Cluck still keeps saying to go to the syllabus for due dates and stuff, and there's no due dates in the syllabus. I've emailed her and I've sent her a message and she hasn't responded, and so I have no idea when the test is due. And I tried to click on the test, and it tells me that I don't have access to it. And with that test, you know, it shows them, and it might not be available yet, but it shows them. And this one, it's not even showing me, so I don't know what the heck is going on.
Yeah, you know, Rebecca is a good one to ask about that too, and same with Lynn, because they know what they're full-time staff. And Canvas, I'm just getting used to. I mean, I'll share screen here, and I'll take a look and take a look see as to what Canvas is looking like from my end, and it's let's see if I get onto good old Canvas here. I thought I was nicely on good old Canvas, but it appears I wasn't. Anyway, I'd like to do it. Okay, I'm going to just log on here and get onto it the way I normally do. There. And sign in the way I normally do. Click here to log in. And there's how I see Canvas. Can you see this,
yeah,
Kelly?
That's pretty much what we see.
Do you guys then? Okay.
Dashboard and all this over here, and then we have the Canvas button up there.
Right. This is what Is this what yours looks like too? Okay.
Yeah, I have my classes. I have the classes I'm in and all that.
Okay. Yeah. And then do you see home and coursework? Do you get that?
Yeah. Well, for the first time when I logged on, I'm like, "Where's the course? You know, where's the assignments?"
Yeah.
And I was freaking out. I mean, I'm clicking all over.
I know. Well, we all are. We are all. If you click under coursework, like I'm doing.
Yeah, then you find it.
Then you see your units.
Home and he starts clicking. He goes, "Well, it's right here." I go, "Well, how are you supposed to know to click on that?"
I know it. I know it. So we're in good old Unit 1. And when you're in Unit 1, of course, then you'll see all of this stuff, and you see the links or whatever. I'm going to have to be phoning OTC help desk to find out how to upload this Zoom session that we're doing today. I have to find out exactly how to upload that to Canvas, because I don't normally do it that way. So that's my homework right after this class. Right after this class, I have acoustics at 1:30 Central Time, and then I have anatomy at 3:30 Central. So, yikes. But the basic way that the course is laid out, I mean, I'm going to just show you here. I'll close Canvas a little bit, and I'll blow this up here so you can see this in the middle of the screen. Basically, the way I see the course going, you'll see the units 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, down through 8. And that's how they correspond in Canvas. And I'm going to be covering linear versus compression for the first couple of weeks. So that people learn what compression is in hearing aids. What's it for? Why do we have it? And then the next unit is practice with compression. Now, compression is read on what's called input-output functions, and I'll be showing you what those are in PowerPoints and all that. But the new book that I wrote, the whole 3rd edition, is on compression. And compression is used in every hearing aid that's sold today. And so it behooves of people to learn what the Sam Hill it is. And it's especially meant for sensory neural hearing loss, which is 95% of hearing loss. Then you'll see another unit, OLC versus WDRC. In English, that just means output limiting compression versus wide dynamic range compression. We'll be talking about that ad nauseum. Basically, OLC, output limiting, is meant for high power hearing aids. And it's a type of compression that suddenly slams on the brakes once the output of a hearing aid is too much. It's like it amplifies the crap out of the signal, but as soon as it gets too loud, slams on the brakes. It's on high power. WDRC is on little old lady Mrs. McGillicuddy hearing aids for mild to moderate sensory neural hearing loss. And WDRC provides maximum amplification for soft sounds. And then it gradually reduces the amplification as the sounds get louder. It's a totally different kettle of fish. Then we kind of summarize, and we'll even talk about two kids, Bill and Till. Those are two types of WDRC. Bill is WDRC in the bass. Till is WDRC happening in the treble. Then we're going to talk about how quickly compression acts. That's Unit 4. How fast does it kick in? Does it kick in like, you know, when you watch Antique Roadshow, the antique and you're seeing the announcer talking about this vase is worth $100,000, and the lady, oh my goodness, and you're hearing the audience in the back, you can hear it flutter. That's using fast-acting compression. Slow-acting compression, fast-acting, will cover what that is, because it's used in every digital hearing aid. Then we'll move into digital hearing aids, and we'll talk about channels, feedback reduction, and then digital noise reduction, what the heck that is. Then we'll talk about directional microphones versus DNR, digital noise reduction. Both of these, directional mics and digital noise reduction, are meant to increase signal to noise ratio. Break it down very simply. Hearing aids have to do two things: provide gain or amplification. That's half the battle. The other one is increase speech compared to noise. Increase the signal to noise ratio. And the two ways we do that is digital noise reduction and directional mics. So it's like the first half of the course is on compression, and then the second half of the course is on other stuff in digital hearing aids. Okay? The last unit is called ADRO. Weird. ADRO is actually used at Hearing Lab Technologies, Sam's Club. There's lots of OTC graduates who work at Sam's Club, and they work for a place called HLT. And HLT, Hearing Lab Technology, sells ADRO. And ADRO is actually out of Australia, and it is a linear type of hearing aid, digital hearing aid, but it's actually back to linear. Look at number 1. It's using an old technology in a new way. And it's really, really interesting. That's how we finish the course. All right? So that's kind of like an overview of the entire course. And I'll stop sharing here for a sec. And does that kind of give you a bit of a picture? All right. And it's kind of, we can now, what I think I'll try and do is, let's see, share screen again. And I'll see if I can pull up the notes that I've got here. I'll squish this little guy here and pull up our good old notes that we got for today. It's going to be interesting in 110, acoustics, getting the students to navigate through Canvas and to upload their notes and everything. Yikes. But that's a battle for this afternoon. Anyway, what we've got here, I had to change things from last time when I taught this course, because last time the page numbers were all different as well. Last time my book was second edition. It was a little brown thing. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, Kelly, but it was just this little brown textbook that kind of looked like this, kind of a brown.
I haven't seen that one. I got the red.
Yeah, this is the one. And it's actually about double the thickness too. Yeah. So it's got a whole chapter on real ear measurement and everything in it. So I've had to kind of change things around. And I'll also pull up the PowerPoint soon too. But we'll start out in this course learning how to read graphs. This course follows from 140. 140 is all about, and you've had that course, is all about the hardware of hearing aids. It's all about the mic, the amp, the receiver, volume control, batteries, troubleshooting, ear mold impressions, all of the nuts and bolts. This course follows up from that and talks more about the software, because hearing aids are digital, and digital uses software. So you might, if you're thinking about computers, think of your 140 course as learning about your hard drive, your monitor, your USB ports, your plugins and all the your keyboard. And this course is about the software, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, stuff like that. So that's kind of the parallel way in which I would be describing the course. And hearing aids have always been described in terms of graphs. Graphs, graphs, graphs. And part of this course is to teach people how to read those graphs, because those graphs are specs. Hearing aids all are produced according to specifications. And the specs all have to line up with ANSI, American National Standards Institute. I got emails popping in here, ignore that. Anyway, so when you read at the top of the page here, gain in dB versus output in dB-SPL, the basic formula for any hearing aid in the world is input plus gain is output. Three things. Input plus gain is output. Input is what's coming into the mic of the hearing aid. Input is the sound around you, speech, whispering, background noise, wind, whatever. And input is always measured in terms of dB, SPL. It's always, okay? Anytime you see the vertical axis of the graph reading dB SPL, you know it's not describing the gain. Gain is the second piece. Gain is what the hearing aid is doing to the input. How much is the hearing aid adding to the input? Okay, and gain is the muscle of the hearing aid. And gain is always specified in simple dB. Not dBHL, not dBSPL, just simple dB. And the third part of the thing, output. Well, output is the sum total. So input plus gain is the output. And output, again, just like input, is measured in dB-SPL. Always, always, always. The two things you're going to read on graphs with hearing aids is basically gain and output. And output will be specified in dB-SPL. Gain will be specified in dB. And this harks back to 110 acoustics. And you will now recall when we described, and I will stop sharing for a second, when we described the decibel in Unit 2 of acoustics. And we said that dB-SPL, 0 dB-SPL, does not represent no sound. 0 dB-SPL is the softest it takes for a normal hearing person to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker. Whatever softest pressure required, we'll call that 0 dB-SPL. That's the ground. If you want to know if the apartment is twice as tall as the house, you have to know where the ground is. So always remember that 0 dB-SPL does not, repeat, not represent the absence of sound. It's just an arbitrary reference was one day decided after World War II. Let's call that the softest it took for a normal hearing person to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance. Okay. So then every other sound that's louder, if you increase the pressure by 10, you go up 20 dB, and increase the pressure by another 10, you go up 40 dB, and so on. You remember that stuff. That's all dB-SPL. And those are called, wow, there's an airplane just buzzing away up there. Be quiet. Anyway, and those are all dB-SPL because they are referenced to the ground. Those are called absolute values. So now back to our screen. Read here with me. Output and input are absolute dB values. They are referenced to an absolute value called 0. Gain, on the other hand, is a relative term. Relative. Take a 10 dB SPL input, a real soft input. I can add 50 decibels of gain to that. And what will I have? A 60 dB SPL output. Input plus gain is output. I can take a 20 dB SPL input and add 50 dB of gain to that. And what will I get? 70 dB SPL. See, when you're adding SPL and dB, you can repeat CAN, underline can, add like 1 plus 2 is 3. So 50 dB input, 50 dB SPL input, plus 50 dB of gain is 100 dB SPL output. 50 and 50 is 100. That's the beauty of our field of hearing aids. We can add decibels, easy peasy Japanesey. But what was I talking about in acoustics when I said, oh, you can't add decibels just like that? Well, that's when you were adding 2 dB SPL values together. Then you can't. Okay, so if you got one machine making 80 dB SPL in one corner of the room and another machine making 80 dB SPL in the other corner of the room, the total isn't 80 plus 80 is 160. Sorry, the total is 83. Okay, and how much did you gain? 3 dB. Because 80 plus 3, so 80 dB SPL plus 3 dB is 83 dB SPL. You can add a dB SPL and a relative dB value. And you can add them like 1 plus 2 is 3. And that's what we're doing for the rest of this course. So all the stuff about machines, throw away, you don't need it. We've come to the corner where you can add input plus gain is output, just like 1 plus 2 is 3. Why? Because you're adding an absolute value, input, in dB SPL, plus a relative value like gain, which is just dB, getting a sum total output, which is in dB SPL again. So why I say gain is relative is because, let's take a gain of 50. I can add that gain of 50 to 10, and I'll get 60. I can add that gain of 50 to 20 dB SPL, and I'll get 70. I can add that gain of 50 to 30 dB SPL, and I'll get 80 dB SPL output, because 30 and 50. So that gain is relative. And 50 is whatever. So that's why it's specified in simply dB. dB SPL always represents absolute intensity values. Input and output are always displayed in terms of SPL. dB represents relative intensity values, not absolute, relative. Gain is a relative value. For example, you can add, don't know how to spell add, A-D, like an advertisement. You can add 50 dB of gain to a 10 dB SPL input or to a 20 dB SPL input, etc. It's relative. The formula for dB SPL, you can all that's just review. You don't need to memorize it for this course. This is just describing. This is summarizing what you kind of covered in acoustics last semester. And here it is. This is why D0 does not represent no sound, blah, blah, blah. It's the softest pressure it takes to hear, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so basically this is all just summarizing and describing things to you. Okay, enough on that. Let's go to some PowerPoint. Linear versus compressione. Why not? Linear versus compression. Basically, when you're looking at history of hearing aids, I got this bar here crossing, I don't know why, but whatever. Oh, there it went away. Lovely. This is also out of the textbook. Here you've got time happening over the past few decades, and here you've got the technology. This is important. Not that you memorize this. I'm not asking anybody to do that because I couldn't do it, but just kind of get the idea, the general gist of hearing aid history. In the beginning, you had body aids and BTEs. They were all linear. We're going to describe what linear is. They were all class A or B, which is an old-fashioned amplification system that distorted like crazy. If you had a loud input of, say, 60 or 70 decibel input, someone's talking yakety yakety yak, and then you had a lot of gain, like 60 dB of gain. Well, 60 and 60 is going to be 120. That's going to be too loud. So what did those hearing aids do? They limited the maximum output of the hearing aid, and they did it with something called peak clipping, which was, why did the hearing aid sound like I'm calling you from the bottom of the pole? Hello? We've all heard speakers that are overdriven when they, and that's literally that's slapping the sides of the box. It's distorting. Compression emerged as a way to get around that problem. In the 1970s, I had hair down to my waist, smoked everything except cigarettes. Bad boy, you know, it was during the time of the Who and the Pink Floyd and all that. Clunky ITEs. The world's first compression emerged. It was output limiting compression, found on high power hearing aids. And then in the canal hearing aids came out in the 80s, and a new type of amplifier called a Class D emerged, and WDRC came out in compression. And hearing aids were programmable. In other words, you didn't have to use a screwdriver to change the settings of the hearing aid. You didn't need that anymore. You could program them on a computer. You could connect them up to your desktop computer, because laptops didn't exist, big IBM desktop computers, and you could program them. Or the manufacturer would give you a handheld programmer, a little, and it was dedicated. It would be about the size of this little book here, and that was be connected to the hearing aid by a wire. And it would only program that hearing aid. That's all it would do. You couldn't do anything else with it. It wasn't an app-filled thing. It was just, and you could program that hearing aid for how much bass, how much treble, how much gain to give, blah, blah, blah. The 90s was the golden age of hearing aids. This is where digital hearing aids first emerged and where analog hearing aids ended. Look what it says there in italics. End of the analog era. Right there. But in the early 90s, CICs came out. And hearing aids also became multi-channel. Now, multi-channel, I'll stop sharing here. Multi-channel means, think of my hand as a frequency response. Bass, mids, treble. Okay, think of the bottom here as being frequency and the vertical as being decibels of gain. So that's my hand. Frequency along the bottom, and then the amount of gain is the height. Well, multi-channel means you had individual fingers. You had this little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed home. In other words, a treble channel, a treble to mid channel, a mid to low channel, a low frequency channel. And you could change any one of them at will, multi-channel. Okay, you could do whatever you wanted with at Alice's restaurant. So hearing aids became very, very flexible. Instead of sort of reducing the treble or sort of reducing the bass, you could sculpt, literally sculpt the shape of the frequency response to match anyone's hearing loss. So it was pretty cool. It was a real advance. Directional mics returned. They actually were invented in World War II. Directional mics were invented in the military. And what are directional mics? They are mics intended to pick up sounds from the direction in which they face. They're not meant to be picking up sounds from all around. Directional mics are meant to be like a tunnel. Okay, and they are used in order to increase the signal to noise ratio so that you can hear the person you want to hear across the table better than the other loud tables in the restaurant. directional microphones. They came out in hearing aids in the 80s, but they were left alone and discarded. And in the 90s, they had a renaissance, a rebirth. They came back. And you know why they came back? Because digital noise reduction didn't work. This is hilarious. In 1997, the world's first digital hearing aid came out by Widex. It was called the Widex Senso, S-E-N-S-O. And you should have heard the sound of engineers crying. Have you ever heard engineers weep? All the manufacturers at AAA, at the American Academy of Audiology. I worked at Unitron. You had Bernafon, Oticon, Unitron, Starkey, all the different Resound, all the different manufacturers there, and Widex had come out with its digital hearing aid first. The first horse to leave the barn, and it had digital noise reduction. All the manufacturers were freaking. Oh, the sky is falling. We're gonna, oh, they're so far ahead of us. We're never gonna catch up. Oh boy. Well, guess what? Digital noise reduction didn't increase the signal to noise ratio. It didn't work. It felt nice. In a loud environment, the whole hearing aid would get softer. But then so would the speech. In other words, when it decreased the noise, it threw the baby out with the bathwater. So it didn't increase the signal to noise ratio. So guess what? In 1998, the very next year, directional mics came back huge, because they do increase the signal to noise ratio. And that's why all digital hearing aids today use directional mics. Directional mics you can think of as the head. They're the science. They actually do increase the signal to noise ratio, whereas digital noise reduction is the heart. It's the subjective side. It's the feel-good side. And you need both. They work well as a team. One's objective, one's subjective. One's the head, one's the heart. One's the science, one's the art. I guess that's how I piece those things together that way. Anyway, so the last decade and up till now, receiver in canal, BTEs, open fit BTEs, personal sound amplification products, yikes. OTCs, over-the-counter hearing aids. I always love that acronym. Digital continues, all types of compression, even something called expansion. We'll be looking at that. Automatic anti-feedback. And fitting software becomes king, because really detailed questions. And I have to laugh. I'm going to stop share for a second. You're going to find in labs, looking at hearing aid fitting software, sometimes it becomes almost anti-intellectual. It becomes like a push this button type of thing. In other words, does your client have trouble hearing the preacher every second Sunday at a distance of 30 feet at a 45-degree angle? If so, press this button. You don't know what you just did, but maybe it'll work. You know, it's kind of like, and then you get these clinicians out there. Many of you will be doing your practicums with these clinicians, and they don't know what it is that they just did. They just push that button because that's what the software said to do, but they never followed it up with real ear measurement. They never said, okay, let's find out what pushing that button actually did do. What did it do? Well, how about putting a tube in the ear, putting the hearing aid on there, and finding out what the difference was? That's why you do real ear. Instead of saying, okay, how does that sound? Well, how does that sound? Well, how does that sound? Well, that's a subjective thing. We need to pair that off, and that's important to have, but you have to also pair it off with the objective thing, because we're both art and science. This is a fitting field, but it also has a bit of a medical technical part, and we have to show what it is that we actually did. So I don't know, that's just something to kind of, those are introductory summary type comments. Next slide. Let's see if I can go to the next slide here. So here you go. Speech and noise plus hearing aids is problems in noise. So we are addressing not now just the gain of a hearing aid. The gain of a hearing aid is linear or compression, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. We're talking the second thing, increasing signal to noise ratio here. Speech and noise plus hearing aids is problems in noise. And how come? Hearing aids need to do two things: provide gain for the hearing loss, increase signal to noise ratio, and there's three things to note here. Number one, the cochlea is a WDRC circuit. Now, look at that sentence again. The cochlea is a WDRC circuit. How the Sam Hill is that true? Well, what did we learn in anatomy class? Outer hair cells help inner hair cells pick up soft sounds. Inner hair cells can only pick up sounds from 50 and above. The outer hair cells, if those are gone, the person will have a presbycusis of about 50 dB. The outer hair cells, on the other hand, help the inner hair cells pick up soft sounds. And what is WDRC? Exactly that. In a hearing aid, it amplifies soft sounds by a lot. Loud sounds, it bags off, it doesn't touch them. It only amplifies soft sounds. So in a way, wide dynamic range compression is like an electronic imitation of the outer hair cells. Okay, that's literally. Number two, compression is a gain issue. Okay, only gain, doesn't talk about increasing signal to noise ratio. Compression, here where my cursor is, only addresses number one. D mics, directional mics, and digital noise reduction address signal to noise ratio over here. And these will not be covered in the beginning of the course. We're only going to be looking at gain for the first half. Cochlear anatomy and physiology, old versus new. This is all just review. You can just hear relaxing and watching dust blinking lights. In fact, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. Put some Baileys in that and get the morning started right. Okay, huge shift occurred at the start of the 90s, parallel to the explosion in hearing aid technology. As I had mentioned earlier, the 90s was the explosion. Outer hair cells versus inner hair cells. The anatomy and physiology is very different. And that knowledge became known in the 1990s. So you can date your audiologists like rings on a tree. Do they know the difference between the outer and inner hair cells? If yes, they graduated after 1990. If no, they graduated before 1990. And that's why hearing aids exploded in technology, because wide dynamic range compression emerged to imitate the outer hair cells. And I know we barely don't know what that is. Just suffice to say that WDRC means amplifying soft sounds by a lot, amplifying loud sounds by little or nothing at all. And in that way it imitates outer hair cells. There, somebody even got into painting the outer hair cells with watercolors. Now this person was a nerd. It's not me, okay? Inner hair cells on the right, I should say inner hair cells on the left, outers on the right. Fitting the eye versus fitting the ear. Basically, as we've learned before, the hair cells are the retina of the cochlea. The retina changes light into electricity. The hair cells change traveling waves into electricity. Outdated view of the organ of Corti. Look at this. Inner hair cells, outer hair cells. You know what? I graduated in 1988, so I didn't know the difference. I learned this afterwards. I learned this from working at Unitron later on, and at the University of Oklahoma when I was studying there for my PhD, but that was later. But my master's audiology, this is how we learned it. Outers, they look just like inner hair cells. Nope. Turned out not to be true at all. Actually, this picture here got replaced with this picture here. And now the very different shapes of the hair cells, inners versus outers. totally and completely. Not only are they shaped different, but the hairs on top are arranged differently. Inners, like the US side of the falls. Outers, like the Canadian side of the waterfalls. You're looking here at the outer hair cells normal. You're looking here at the outer hair cells damaged. Normal, damaged. Not only are the hairs all gone, but so are the test tube shapes underneath. Outers die before inners. Outer hair cell pathology is sensory hearing loss. Inner hair cell pathology that follows is neural hearing loss. That's why they call it sensory neural. Okay? Neural means inner hair cells and eighth nerve. Outer hair cells causes sensory. Sensory hearing loss is mild to moderate with fair speech discrimination. Neural is usually more severe with terrible speech recognition. And therein lies your two populations of hearing loss. And as I said last semester, the hardest people to fit are those with mild to moderate loss because they can still hear without their hearing aids. So they are expecting a miracle. And the glass is half empty. Whereas the severe, the neural hearing loss, they simply can't hear without the hearing aids. Relative sizes of hairs on a head compared to hair cells is seen here in this picture. And here may be the hair cell, but look at this, you got 100 hairs on top of the hair cell. Here's an inner hair cell. This is all review, but I just here, and here's an outer hair cell, inner, outer, inners, outers, and most pathology looks like this. Most damage to outers, not so much to inners. Leaving perfect hearing looking like this, impaired hearing looking like this, and it doesn't matter whether you're from China or from USA, it doesn't matter. The problem is the same. What's happened, a quick review here because it all bears compression in context. It's very important. If you're looking at inner hair cells as a line following my cursor, here's the cochlea unrolled, 1 inch long, this whole orange thing. The high frequency basal end of the cochlea, the wide end, has the narrowest basilar membrane. 3 rows of outer hair cells follow my cursor to the middle. 4 rows of outer hair cells. 5 rows of outer hair cells here. But ironically, this is the tippy top of the cochlea. The widest hair cell region is at the narrow end of the cochlea. The narrow hair cell region is at the wide end of the cochlea. But the point I'm drawing here is this wave happening where my cursor is. When the person is hearing a low frequency tone, for example, in this example, look at how many frequencies are stimulated. The outer hair cells add to this peak. They do 2 things. They amplify and they sharpen. We can amplify with hearing aids. That's a linear and a compression issue. But sharpening the wave, we cannot ever do. What's lost is lost, and we cannot regain what went down with the flood. So the person with damaged outer hair cells has a traveling wave that looks like this. They can't separate frequencies close together like this guy can. Okay? That sharpening is gone. That's why the people need not only amplification, but that's why they need to increase signal to noise ratio, because this guy can separate speech from background noise much better than this guy can. Okay, so this is piecing together the anatomy found in hearing loss with compression and digital features found in this course. And that's why anatomy is so important to grasp as a hearing aid practitioner, because now you know the reasons why you've got all these different things in the hearing aids. The first chapter of this course is compression, compression, compression. A gain, gain, gain issue. It's addressing the height that the outer hair cells add. The second chapter of this course, after the midterm, addresses the sharpening. That's stuff that we can't ever bring back for the person, so we use directional microphones and digital noise reduction to help achieve a better signal-to-noise ratio so that this guy can separate speech from background noise. You might wonder what this middle picture is that I keep going over. Well, that's just a whole bunch of traveling waves happening with the word information. You can see information down here, and you can see the waves near the apex of the cochlea. This is the width of the cochlea unrolled, and this is time going down. And you can see all your traveling waves in, and then little tiny high frequency sounds with F, informe, shh, follow my cursor, shh, shun, okay? And on each one of these stinking traveling waves, sharpening takes place. So the cochlea is a holy and august, majestic organ indeed. Normal hearing person hearing two tones close together, two traveling wave peaks. Loss of outer hair cells, the peaks are smaller and more rounded, just like this picture here. However, you take a hearing aid, you put it on this middle person, and you've got a bigger, dull traveling wave. I can't restore the peaks, hence the use of, so this is using gain, but now because we can't make this out of this, we use directional microphones and digital noise reduction. Outer hair cells and how do they work? Basically, you can see these things is stretching and shrinking and pulling down that tectorial membrane to bend those hair cells. This is what it's doing with soft inputs. 10 dB SPL, 20 dB, this is what your cochlea is doing with soft inputs. The outer hair cells somehow are given the message to pull this membrane down in order to bend the hairs of the inner hair cells where my cursor is. If the sounds are 50 dB SPL or more, there's sufficient fluid motion taking place in the cochlea to wiggle those hairs. Okay? But basically, that's why WDRC was invented. Here we go. Compression. What it can do to otherwise good people. It can drive you bonkers. Designers of compression actually look like this. Okay? Actually, this is Lynn Royer here. This is Becca. This is Bob Siegel. And this is me trying to suck up. Okay, basically, when you're looking at linear amplification, let's just kind of dive into this. We got another 10 minutes to go. We're good. We're good. This is kind of like, hey, how are you? Take a chill pill. Input.
I went over this in your book a couple of times so I could grasp it. You know what I mean?
Yep. And that's why we're going to take our. That's why we're going to take our time here. We're going to look real easy. We're going to just take our sweet time. I'm going to hit. I want to hit that slide for a second. I want to just fix the numbers a little bit. Okay. I'm just going to slide this guy over here. Move these numbers a little bit so they line up a little better, okay? That's what I'm doing. I got this PowerPoint loaded on my own laptop so I can just play with it. Okay, now I'll make it big again. Here we go. So, you have input is always on the horizontal. Always. Output of the hearing aid is always on the vertical. Always, always, always. No matter what manufacturer, no matter what hearing aid, always, always. And remember what we said at the beginning, input is always measured in dB SPL. So if you look at these input numbers, they represent 0 dB SPL, 20 dB SPL, 40 dB SPL, 60, and so on. Output is always also represented in dB SPL, 60 dB SPL, 80, 100, 120. Now this is just a fictitious example here. Not all hearing aids don't do exactly this, okay? They'll have different numbers, but nonetheless, I'm just giving you an example. So here we go. This is called an input-output function. I/O function, I/O function, input-output. And that's how all hearing aid gain is read. So let's look at this particular example. This is a hearing aid pulled out of Ted's head saying, okay, here's an example of a hearing aid that we're going to talk about. And this hearing aid used linear gain. Look at the title, linear amplification. So check this out. What did this particular hearing aid do? With 0 dB SPL input, its output was 60. What's the gain? 60. 0 plus 60 is 60. With 20 dB SPL inputs, what did the hearing aid do? It made 80 dB SPL outputs. 20 plus 60 is 80. With 40 dB SPL inputs, the hearing aid made 100 dB SPL output. Its gain was 60 again. And with 60 dB SPL inputs, the output was 120. Can you see that the gain here was always 60, 60, 60? That's why it was called linear. Because look at the line, look at the yellow line, linear. It was linear gain. It's a 45-degree angle. Always tit for tat. As the input increased by 20, the output increased by 20. And have a look right at my cursor as I'm showing you that. As the input increased by 20, the output increased by 20. As the input increased by another 20, the output increased by another 20. Input, output, tit for tat. They call this a 1-to-1 compression ratio. 1-to-1, because 20 over 20 is 1 over 1. It's the same thing. As my input increases by 20, my output increases by 20. So the first number on an input-output ratio is increases to input slash increases to output. Input slash output.
So the left corner is always the amount of gain, basically.
Yep, that's correct. That's exactly it.
I mean, that's the best way to look at it.
That's the best way to look at it. That's what I do. Yep.
Okay.
You've preceded me because I was. That's good. So now look at this. Look at this horizontal line. Whoa! Here's where the proverbial crap hits the fan. Because let's say you didn't want any more than 120 to come out of that hearing aid because you're going to cause noise-induced hearing loss. So suddenly the hearing aid went into what was called peak clipping. So that no matter, even watch my cursor, as the input increased, sorry, the output did not increase. As the input increased, the output stayed the same at 120. They call that peak clipping. And I'll stop sharing and I'll just describe in English what that means. When you have a speaker moving back and forth, a speaker cone, and it's going da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, it's inside a little metal box. And that's called your receiver in a hearing aid. The speaker is inside a little metal box. And that speaker can vibrate. That's cool. It's making sound waves. Fine. But if it wiggles too much, it's literally slapping the sides of the metal box. And that's peak clipping. And that's going to cause distortion. Hello, can you hear me? So the hearing aid is going to go into distortion, but you've limited the maximum power output. That's the way old hearing aids worked. Excuse me. They all used linear peak clipping. So they sounded great if the input was moderate and if the gain was kept fairly low, because input plus gain is output. So if the input was kept at a dull roar and the gain was kept at a dull roar, then the sum total output did not cause peak clipping. Now you, the clinician, were the one that set the peak clipping. You decided, did you want it at 110? Did you want it at 120? Did you want it at 125? And that was based upon the listener's UCLs during your hearing test. And what did you do to get your amount of peak clipping? You took the UCL and you added about 15 to 20. So if the guy's UCL was 100 dBHL, You added about 15 to 20 to that. And you said, okay, in dB-SPL, that's going to be about 115, 120. In dB-HL, his UCL may be 100, but hearing aids are measured in dB-SPL. So I have to convert 110 dB-SHL, his UCL, I have to convert that into the maximum power output that I want the hearing aid to do, and that's measured in dB-SPL. And the difference across the speech frequencies between HL and SPL is about 15, 20 dB. That's why, and that's how the peak clipping amount was decided.
So is the UCL plus the 15 to 20, is that dB-SPL or just
dB-SPL. Yep.
dB-SPL?
So let's say this guy, his UCL was 110, or let's say his UCL was 100. This clinician might have said, okay, I'm going to add 20. You can add 15 to 20. I'm going to add 20 to that. Okay, I'm going to choose a maximum power output. I want my peak clipping to kick in at 120 dB-SPL. Okay, good. All right, let's look at this. Let's look at this particular graph. Here's a little quiz. What's the gain in this particular picture? And you look at it, and as Kelly said, look at the bottom left corner, and you'll see that 0 in was 60 out. So the gain here, to answer question number 1, is the gain is 60. Just by looking at the graph, how do you know the gain is linear? Well, because you got this, the gain.
45.
Yep, 45-degree angle. Yep. And what will raising or lowering the MPO do on this graph? Well, it'll raise or lower this red line. But now check this out, number 4. This is the weird part. Now, what will raising or lowering the volume control do on this graph? In other words, what will changes of gain? Not changes in maximum power output. What will changes in gain? What if I made the gain 50 instead of 60? What if I made the gain 70 instead of 60? What would that do? Well, what would that do is it would slide. Here we go. It would slide. I'm going to copy this. Let's see if I can copy that puppy. And I'll paste it. It would slide the line right or left. So look at this now. What happened here? If we look at this picture closer, what's happening here? Okay, now your gain, has your gain increased or decreased?
Right or left? I'm trying to remember what in your book it said.
Yeah. This is great. No, but you know what I tell, you know what I always tell people? Just let the graph tell the story. Just let the graph talk to you. Over here, let's, for example,
it decreased.
You're correct. It decreased the gain
because it was here's 20. So did it decrease to 40?
Yeah, it decreased. Watch this. Let's let the graph talk. Here, let's look at the original blue line. 40 in was 100 out. So that's a gain of 60, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Now let's look at the second line. 40 in was
equals
80 out.
So that's 40. Okay, got
40.
it.
And that's why I always just tell people, let the graph tell the story. Just let it say. So what we can summarize here is this. Increases in gain means that the line here, the diagonal line, would go to the left. And decreases of gain means that the diagonal line goes to the right. It's exactly backward to the way that one would think. And this is a fundamental rule about how to read input-output graphs. It's a fundamental way to read them. Now, I'll see if I can find that PowerPoint again. Here we are. All right, cool. I'll take that line and just let it disappear. I'll go to the next picture. Here's compression. And we're just about done for today. Here's the first compression. Look what it did. The world's first compression, here I'm making the graph the same. We'll just keep it at 60. You have in the very same graph. What's different here? Over here, the line is flat. In this picture, the line got bent a little bit. It's not totally flat. It's kind of like this. So in other words, like an old Supertramp song, give a little bit. The MPO, give a little bit. It gives a little bit, but not as much as the gain. In other words, look at this. Look at my cursor. As the input went from 60 to 80, the output went from 120 to about maybe 125. A little bit. So it wasn't tit for tat. Look at the blue. That's 1-to-1. An increase of 20 input is an increase of 20 output. Another increase of 20, another increase of 20. But here, as I increased by 20, the output did not increase by 20. So in other words, if I increased my input by, say, 20, my output may have increased by only 5. So I had instead of a 20 to 20 ratio or 1-to-1 ratio, I had a 20 to 5 ratio. How would you break that down mathematically?
So that would be 1-to-4? No.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, a 4-to-1.
4-to-1.
4-to-1. You're correct. That's good. A 4-to-1 compression ratio. As my input increased by 4 dB, my output only increased by 1. Or blowing it back up again, as my input increased by 20, my output only increased by 5. People always break it down to the 1, though, because that's the basic. All right? So look what we've covered here. Compression. This is the beginning of compression coverage. This is, you can think on, I'll give you an analogy. Think of, I'll stop sharing because we're about done here. Instead, think of Ted jumping up and down on a bed, because that's the gain. He's jumping up and down. But the ceiling is that maximum output by linear hearing aids. So Ted's head is always going bang against the ceiling. It hurts. Okay? So let's say someone took a sponge and put a sponge along the ceiling. And now my head still hits the ceiling, but it doesn't hurt as bad. It's kind of instead of bang, bang, you know? So hard peak clipping with linear hearing aids caused a lot of distortion. However, when you used compression, you limited the maximum output, but you did it without peak clipping. You can think of another analogy. Think of a river and think of a rapids in the river, a counter current in the river. So the river's still going this way, but you've got a little bit of a counter current. That's like compression. It makes the maximum power output does increase with increases to input, but it increases at a slower rate.
So this has eliminated the distortion that
correct.
With
Yep.
peak clipping.
Correct. That's the advantage of using compression. You still used linear gain, but you limited the maximum power output with compression instead of hard peak clipping. Cool. All right, we will continue on Unit 1 next week. We've gone to the bottom of, I believe it's page 1 here, and I'll share the screen and just take a peek, see where we are, see if I can get out of PowerPoint, and it won't. This crazy thing is being very stubborn. It won't let me, but at any rate, if I look at my notes here, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start at the very bottom of page 1 next week, the very bottom of it. So if I can only get, let's see if I can, fantastic. I've managed to shrink this thing so I can find, here we go. So we've covered page 1 here. All right, we're going to start right at the very bottom of page 1 here, and then we will continue on page 2 next week. We'll give you some examples of it. So a lot of this is going to be repeating. You're going to see, look at this linear gain function, straight 45-degree angle. You can see where it's highlighted. So we're going to just be looking at the input-output functions a little more closely again. And then we're going to start talking more about compression verbally again. But you've covered a lot of it today. So read ahead in your notes. Read your readings on the top of the page for this section out of the textbook, and we'll see you next week. All right?
See you next week, okay.
All right. Live
Have a
long
good
and prosper. All right.
Have good classes today.
Yeah, thank you. I'll stop recording. Maybe this will work.